church will be getting out in about 2 minutes, and everybody will be kind of joining us at that point. But we know that we have streamers, a streamer audience, people who are joining us right this second. And we want to start for you who are with us. Welcome, those of you who are streaming with us. And welcome everybody who's in the room right now. And welcome to everybody who's in the church, who's on their way. I am absolutely thrilled to have our guest with us today. She is one of the faces of the Muslim Public Affairs Council and of a growing number of Muslims throughout the world who are insisting that Islam is, from its core and beginning, a religion of peace and justice and worldwide community, and is offering a counter-narrative to that which is proposed so much by violent proponents of Islam, and unfortunately by a press that is addicted to sensationalism and not going deep. So let me say a few words about our speaker, our presenter, and then another kind of an introductory word about the role I want you all to kind of have in your mind as Edina and I have this conversation. She is the Muslim Public Affairs Council consultant. Previously, as Director of Policy and Programming, she oversaw strategic initiatives in government and policy, media and communications, and leadership development. She was the Communications Director for MPAC, Muslim Public Affairs Council, from 2004 to 2010. She's appeared regularly in major media outlets, included CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, CBS Television, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Associated Press, Chicago Tribune, and Los Angeles Times. She is a recent appointee to Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti's service cabinet. She has been committed to promoting relationships between diverse Angelenos for nearly 15 years, and as co-founder and the current chair of New Ground, a Muslim-Jewish partnership for change. She's proud to be a part of an impactful program whose high school dialogue program was named Governor Jerry Brown's top interfaith group in 2013. We could go on and on and on. She is a professor, she is a leader, she is an organizer. She has an MA in communication from Pepperdine University and a BA in American Literature and Culture from UCLA, where she served as editor-in-chief of the Daily Bruin. And very recently, she was named by the Los Angeles Magazine as one of the 10 top most inspiring women in all of Los Angeles, which is absolutely deserving. And she gave the inaugural sermon for this new amazing phenomenon in the world that started here called the Women's Mosque. Now we're going to talk about all these things, including the fact that she and you and I have as a very soft, a common soft spot in our heart, the love and the recipient of the inspiring leadership of Dr. Maher Hathout, who, along with George Regas, his brother Hassan Hathout, and our rabbi in residence, may his memory always be blessed, Leonard Bierman, were really the core pillars of the interfaith community in Los Angeles and were beacons for the world. And Edina, along with her colleague and brother Salam al-Mariyati and many others, have stepped ably into the shoes of being the next generational leaders of not only Islam, but also of the very important interfaith community of Los Angeles. So it is just thrilling for me to welcome to this Rector's Forum as the first guest of our 2015-2016 program year, Edina Lekovic. Please warmly welcome her.
Thank you, thank you.
You're very welcome. Now, one word about you. Last week, I tried to explain what we're going to be doing this program year in these 7 months before I leave in my spot as rector of All Saints Church. And we're going to be focusing more of our energy on what is the core program, the core agenda, the core values of All Saints Church, much more than me. We'll have to acknowledge the fact that I'm leaving, so we're not in denial from time to time. But our energy is really going to be focused in on what is our core agenda, because that's why we're all here. That's why we give to All Saints Church, is because of these amazing dynamic values. One of which is peace and justice, which are the core values of Islam. One of which is interfaith community. And another is solidarity with one another and interdependence and interconnectedness of all of us. Particularly the issue of solidarity when any of our sisters and brothers become vulnerable or marginalized by historic events. From time to time, it's been very, very important for All Saints Church to stand at the back of our Muslim brothers and sisters. And so I want you to make sure that you have on your head, on your thinking caps today, the hat of an ally, a person who is in solidarity with our sisters and brothers who are trying to hold up the core values of peace and justice in Islam. Okay? Got it. Let's go. All right. So, Edina, tell us this thing about a woman's mosque. What in the world is that?
Good morning, everybody. I'm so excited to be here. So I have to say, before I ever gave a sermon in the women's mosque, the first place I ever gave a sermon was right here at All Saints Church in probably 2005, 2006 or so. And so so All Saints is my second spiritual home, and I am so thrilled to be back here. And of course, All Saints also hosted MPAC's annual convention, the first church in the country, if not in the world, to host a Muslim conference. So being here is coming home in many, many ways. So I thank all of you. The Women's Mosque of America is a unique initiative that I think found the right moment and the right group of leaders. It was an initiative that started about a year ago. The first time I heard about it was last summer when I was at a Ramadan iftar and ran into a young woman in my community who said, I'm going to start a women's mosque. And I practically jumped up and down because I said, well, finally, I'm so glad that you're doing it. Tell me what you have in mind. Long story short, I came to find out that the goal was how would we create a mosque from scratch if it was intended purely for women? So instead of being a reaction to co-ed mosques, it started with a blank slate. From a woman's perspective, what would the ideal mosque look like and sound like and behave? And so from there, they held a series of community town hall forums. They got both women and men involved, and I, meanwhile, had a baby and then got contacted a few months later, and I was actually the backup to the original woman who was supposed to give the first sermon. They asked me to be her understudy, and that still took me a moment to take a deep breath and say yes to being the understudy. And then, unfortunately, she was not able to travel in order to do the sermon, and so I had to take a really deep breath and step up to the plate, because I found myself in a position that I think, I'm going to throw this into gendered terms, but I think many, oftentimes we do as women is, well, why me? Somebody else should do that. Somebody else who has more experience, somebody who's a scholar, somebody, who has a PhD in Islamic studies, somebody who is, more devout than me. I had 1,000 reasons, 1,000 excuses in my head for why it shouldn't be me. And then, after the end of that very long breath, I heard my teacher. I heard Dr. Hattout say to me, of course you've got to do this, because the opportunity exists and because there's an audience there and because there is a real need. And so if I could be the first then it would pave the way for the second and the third and so many more. So I had this really unique opportunity in January to give a sermon, and it was, I think I've prepared for that more than put more preparation into that than I have into many things in a long time. But I used that sermon as an opportunity to talk about how the Women's Mosque is a continuation of our legacy as Muslim women, not a departure from it. Women's mosques have existed in more than a dozen countries around the world, the majority of them in Muslim majority countries. So it's not an unusual, it's not an American phenomena, it's not an American innovation. It's something that has happened, and this just happens to be the first one in the U.S. And that was the first core point, is we are reclaiming our tradition, not throwing away our tradition in order to empower women. And that's part of, I think, what's really relevant for Muslims worldwide is, what does our tradition actually say, rather than what do some fringe elements claim that our faith actually says. So that was the first part of my sermon, and then the second part of my sermon was a call to speak up and stand up and utilize our voices as women in order to use the space of the Women's Mosque to be empowered, to feel confident, and to gain the skills to go out and serve our co-ed mosques. Because we have more than 90% of mosques in the U.S. have policies of allowing women, encouraging women to serve on their boards, but of those mosques who have changed their policies in the last 10 years, and that's probably 20% of them that have changed their policies to encourage women to serve on their boards, only half of them have actually gotten a woman to serve on the board. So we can point our fingers at men all day long, but we also need to look at how do we encourage women and empower them so that they feel confident enough to be able to step into those roles and know that they might be, it's uncomfortable to be the first sometimes, but that it creates a great deal of progress. So after that first experience, I actually 2 months later asked to join the board of the Women's Mosque because I believed in it so much. I certainly didn't need one more thing to do, but I believed in the cause very passionately and believed that it would empower all of our mosques and improve all of our mosques if we had this women's mosque model that could serve the broader community. And I'm really thrilled that we've had so much more positive support, positive feedback than negative feedback, and even mosques, co-ed mosques that have offered to host the Women's Mosque prayer. So this is, I think it speaks to the timing. That this is coming now has been not a game changer, but a natural evolution and next step in the progress of the American Muslim community.
Let's just give that some applause right there. I mean, that is just absolutely an amazing mission. So let's stay with it just a little longer. Could you talk a little bit about some ripple effects, some impacts, something that would give us a taste of what this has meant, either in changing individuals and their lives or transforming the institutions?
So one of my favorite impacts is that this effort has been a real agitator within the American Muslim community at large, in the most positive way possible. In fact, this year, the Islamic Society of North America, which is one of the, probably you could call it an umbrella organization of mosques and institutions in the United States, they have an annual conference that tens of thousands of people attend. And this year, they made women-friendly mosques, or being inclusive, more inclusive towards women in a proactive way, part of their core agenda, to the extent that they had more than 80 women who were speakers at the conference, which is a huge increase, as well as a task force that they created in order to serve all of the mosques that they work with. While they haven't, certainly haven't drawn the line between that and the Women's Mosque, I'd like to think that the agitating role has been one that has caused this kind of change to take place, because while many people have been talking about this issue for many years, unfortunately, I would say that for years it was, well, we've got bigger fish to fry. With post 9/11, there were certainly so many challenges hitting our communities and our mosques that thinking about how we could be more, not just women friendly, but creating more platforms for women to participate equally up on stage, just in the way that they do in the congregation, that's what has changed fundamentally, because now we have this ripple effect where mosques are again, they're not drawing that line themselves, but these issues are going front and center. And the social media conversations that have happened, even from more conservative clerics who I wouldn't call all that woman-friendly, they too have recognized, while we might not like this women's mosque, it shows that there is a real problem that we have to address and that we have to look at. So they're not endorsing, even those voices aren't necessarily endorsing us, but it's causing them to look more closely at what's going on within their own communities. So that's the external ripple effect that I'm really proud of, and that's getting bigger and broader. The internal effect, with one of the reasons that I went from being a volunteer to asking to be on the board was because I saw how moved women were by just the experience. So your typical co-ed mosque, when you go into Friday prayers, you go in, you hear the call to prayer, which is beautiful. You hear a sermon, you do the prayers together, and then everybody vanishes and goes off back to work because it's Friday at 1 o'clock. At the women's mosque, we have a Jummah, or Friday service, once a month. It starts with announcements that talk about how this is a come as you are space. You can choose to cover your hair, not cover your hair, come as you are. It's your choice. There's no policing that's involved here. So that was the first step. Then we have a call to prayer from a woman. And I can't put into words what hearing the call to prayer from just hearing a woman's voice give it tunes me into my spiritual connection in a different way. And that's been really spectacular. Then you have a sermon that's given by a woman, and the topics that women talk about are not, I've never heard any of these sermons given by men in co-ed mosques that I've been to, whether it's about how to survive sexual violence and how to support the survivors of sexual violence, or whether it's about standing up and utilizing our voices as women, or whether it's about the relationship that mothers and daughters have. Any number of things that you just wouldn't hear from a man's voice in the pulpit. And so it's a complementary space. One of the most valuable things that happens during the whole thing is after the prayers, we have a reflection circle. So women who can stay, and we sit around in a circle on the floor, and they have the opportunity to either ask questions or share their own experiences on the topic that was addressed. And that is where I have seen women's hearts open and connect with one another, that they are allowing themselves to be vulnerable, and they are sharing things that often they haven't shared with anybody. And that's where it is that reflection circle that inspired me to want to get more deeply involved, because I have seen women who, some of them haven't attended a mosque in decades because they didn't feel comfortable. Others attend a co-ed mosque every week, but they see and feel something different here. And so that space of sisterhood that's being created where women are supporting women, not as oppressed beings, but as people who are looking for more, that's what really gets me motivated to continue to do this work and to look for other places where we might develop chapters of the women's mosque. And we're already getting, women who are asking us to develop chapters, and we can't keep up with them, which is a good problem to have.
Golly Moses, I want to say, my, Lord, 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 Allah, Allah, Allah.
All the same.
All the same. So speaking of theology, before we go on to what I told you was going to be our agenda, I too am moved by the call to prayer. So for those of us who would love to hear it again, I'm not going to ask you to sing it in Arabic, but I am going to ask you to tell us what it is in English, because it is such a powerful theological statement about prayer and about God.
Okay, so the words you usually hear it start with in Arabic are Allahu Akbar, which many people have been sort of traumatized by these words because they hear them in terrible contexts. But it starts 4 times with Allahu Akbar, which means God is greater than anything that we know, all-encompassing, before the beginning of all things, after the end of all things. And so we start with that. God is greater, God is greater, God is greater, God is greater. So, and I testify that there is no God but God. I don't worship anything else besides the one God, and that Muhammad is his final messenger, not his only messenger, but his final messenger. Sorry, I have to do the translation in my head. I can't sing. You don't want to hear my voice. I try not to torture my children with my voice. And then he says, yes, come to prayer, come to prayer, come to success, come to success. God is greater, God is greater. There is no God but God. So it's an incantation and a remembrance that of God's omnipresence, God's greater power than we have, and that coming to prayer is a way of coming to success. That it is not just about God, but that it is about finding our own success. And so, so that's the brief translation.
That's exactly what I was hoping for. It's just so amazing. I can't forget my wife and friends and us being on a roof in Turkey and hearing the Blue Mosque and all the muezzins all over calling us to prayer. So thank you for that. So we want you to talk to us about challenges that you face as a practitioner of Islam. But before we get there, you wrote a piece recently, I think it was in Huffington Post, about the 5 points of light for American Muslims in 5 years. So could you talk, in addition to the Women's Mosque, other things that are inspiring you and encouraging you, transforming you, and empowering you to be a courageous, creative person of faith?
Absolutely. So thank you for giving me an opportunity to talk about positive things, because I have to talk about Islamophobia all the time, and we will get there. But I think that some of the most inspiring things that are going on today are truly made possible because of social media. As cliche as that sounds, so much of the changes that I have seen within the American Muslim community have been enabled and fueled by social media. And the main reason for that is that social media has taken away the power of the gatekeepers. Whether it's, we see this in the level of public officials or in media, but we also see this in the level of within our own community institutions. So 15 years ago when I started my professional life and we worked with mosques and within communities to help amplify the voices of mainstream Muslims, we often got stuck at the gatekeeper level. So if you want to go in and we want to have community discussions about taboo subjects, well, if the imam or the board doesn't want to do that, you're dead, right? Like, you're not dead, but you're stopped in the water, right? You can't go any further. And so you would just go knock on one door after another, hoping that those doors would be open. Social media has totally turned everything upside down because that accountability is public and that creative space has been democratized. So that now we have young American Muslims who are creating media platforms. Right? It used to be that we would think in terms of, well, maybe we could start at a Muslim TV station or a Muslim newspaper or things like that. That's old media. In new media, young Muslims have created media platforms where they speak for themselves, where they raise the issues that are relevant within their communities, and where all eyes within our communities are able to see not just what's happening in my mosque or my community and universalize that, right? Because in my mosque it happens that way, therefore that's the story of American Muslims, but to see that their own experiences might be very particular rather than universal. And to give them tools to see how things are taking place in other areas so that they can find inspiration and practical tools to be able to do that. So one example that I would offer is that at the beginning of this year, there was this tragic hate crime. It hasn't been labeled that way by the authorities, but there were 3 young people who were shot dead in their apartment by a neighbor who claimed it was over a parking dispute. But that's a bunch of hooey. These young people were seemingly killed because they were Muslim. They were 3 university students, and fantastic ones at that. Students who were deeply involved in community service and working with the homeless, shot dead. 10 years ago, if this had happened, the reaction that I would have expected to see in the Muslim community is one that many people probably wouldn't know about it, because if it didn't make it to CNN, then we didn't know about it, right? But because the family of those victims and their immediate circle of friends started a hashtag that same day of our 3 winners, to focus on the lives that these young people had lived. Out of that came one of the most positive examples of what the positivity that can come out of tragedy. The Our 3 Winners hashtag led to vigils being held all around the country, including here in Los Angeles, to remember their lives. And beyond that, something that they called the Feed Their Legacy campaign, which in dozens of places around the country, young people especially led this campaign to collect food to give to homeless pantries or food pantries so that they could extend the legacy of these young people by paying it forward and by not responding in a negative way, but by responding with love and positivity in the way that would honor their lives. That couldn't have happened even 5 years ago because we didn't have the platforms for that kind of organizing that could happen outside of mosques. And secondly, the voices, and this is the second bright light that I want to point to, is that it used to be 5 or 10 years ago that the only time you would see a Muslim on CNN or Fox News or any one of those places was in the context of bad news, right? People would say to me, "Oh, I saw you on TV. It was so exciting. Congratulations." And I would, have hard feelings about that. And then I eventually came to start saying, "Well, I'm sorry, because that means that something bad happened. Because the only time you're going to see my face, on CNN or any of those exciting places is to explain bad news. It is an uphill battle to try to get even the stories of Muslims fighting extremism and working to prevent extremism to even get out there, let alone positive stories about who we actually are and the kinds of work that we're doing. But that, again, has changed because of social media, because people are holding media accountable and stories that start on the ground, like the I Stand With Ahmed campaign. So you're the clockmaker from Texas. We all know who I'm talking about, the 15-year-old. Why do we know about his story? Because it started on social media, not because CNN took an interest in this kid in Texas. And so the power dynamic has shifted, and that's what gives me the most tremendous hope, because the traditional sources of power and authority, their role is changing. It's not that they're going to move to the sidelines, but they are held more directly accountable to not just serve their communities, but to be innovative, because they have to keep up with the young kids online and even with the adults online rather than the other way around.
Deal. Wow, yes. So I would love to spend time probing all of those, and because of the time, let's also talk about the fact that I think this is another thing that we have in common, those of us who are trying to stand for the peace and justice core of our religions, find ourselves, and I think Muslims and Jews more than any of the rest of us, but let's just talk about Muslims right now, have to kind of be in a defensive posture so frequently against what we generally label as Islamophobia. Bigotry against Muslims. So can you talk about kind of what your recent kind of journey has been? Talking about some more issues you've just called to mind, Ahmed and some others, but there are other more egregious things that have happened, including the ever-present wanting to paint all Muslims with the broad brushstroke of ISIS. So could you just kind of talk about this defensive posture against Islamophobia you have to live with?
Absolutely. Well, I think that it's a cliche, but important to note that I think a lot of the very timely current Islamophobia that we're seeing is being generated by Republican presidential candidates, and that the fuel of Islamophobia is largely politics. That the average person on the street is not, does not have a negative feeling towards Islam and Muslims. It's interesting because while something like 70% of Americans report not knowing a Muslim firsthand, just over half of Americans report having either a neutral or positive perception of Islam and Muslims. Right, and we also know that the single greatest predictor of whether somebody's perception of Muslims is whether they know a Muslim, right? So all these things are sort of really intricately tied. And we also know that in a lot of those red states, people don't know Muslims. Whether they choose not to know them is one thing, but whether they just have a level of exposure or lack a level of exposure, these are important qualities to keep in mind, because the man on the street kind of Islamophobia, I think, has more to do with ignorance, and, a lack of knowledge, or even being given bad information, more so than it does any direct experience. And they are being fueled by and goaded by, largely by politicians or wannabe politicians. So we're seeing, I'll just say Trump and Carson, and hopefully you know exactly what I'm talking about. We don't have to give them more attention than that. But their words labeling, their words saying that Muslims aren't fit to be, or a Muslim wouldn't be fit to serve as president, is of another era. And for a black candidate to presidency to say that another minority group doesn't, wouldn't suit the office is so startling and disturbing on many levels. But the rhetoric that starts up at that level is what is fueling actions on the ground. So that this weekend, there were so-called organized in more than 20 cities around the country anti-Muslim rallies that under the banner of rallies for humanity, right? They don't call it what it is. Rallies for humanity equal anti-Muslim. And so there was going back to social media, there was a huge effort in this past week or two since this knowledge came out to organize and to let our interfaith allies know, speaking of allies, so that we could mobilize and show that the forces of good and love will outnumber the forces of hate and fear. The great news is that these so-called protests that were organized in 20 cities, dozens of people showed up collectively at all these so-called protests. So there was a whole lot of hype, and then very few people actually showed up. In fact, there were more allies who showed up in most of these places than any of the protesters. And so for me, I feel intensely hopeful in a way that I wouldn't have been able to say, again, 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 15 years ago when I was starting my career and feeling the uphill battle. So while the sentiment towards Islam and Muslims is still an area that we need to focus on, for Muslims, I think, we have so many challenges at once, and since 9/11, we have been learning under a national spotlight. When 9/11 happened, the state of the organized American Muslim community consisted of a handful of national organizations that were not really connected, and a network of about 1,000 mosques that were not networked. They were individual silos. The trial by necessity that we have been through in the last decade and a half has caused a great deal of innovation, a great deal of progress, and a great deal of opening up. So that, in fact, today, here in Southern California is Open Mosque Day. If you have time this afternoon, mosques all over Southern California have their doors open and are welcoming visitors. My husband is at the Islamic Center of Southern California. We split up this morning to do double duty. And this was a direct product, again, of bad news, but also knowing that most Islamophobia is rooted in ignorance, not in actual knowledge. And so if we open our doors, if we become more willing to get to know others, that, I think, has been the main challenge for the Muslim community, and it continues to be. When I go out and talk to Muslims of all ages, and particularly young Muslims, that's the number one thing I say to them is, if 9 out of 10 of your friends are Muslim, you're doing something wrong. Get out of your bubble. And we have to be the ones who get outside of our comfort zones and open and get to know people if we want them to get to know us. Because unfortunately, many young people who've grown up here in the post 9/11 environment, they grow up with it's sad for me to even say it, but with an automatic belief that somebody is not going to like them. Right? That it's sort of, guilty until proven otherwise. And that comes from going to public schools or even private schools where They might not just face bullying from other students, but from their world civilizations teachers who, we still get these cases into our offices where, a teacher might call a student a name, or it's not just coming from other students. And so that psychology is part of what we're working to change. But the good news is millennials are a lot more open-minded than previous generations and tend to have more positive views of other communities. And this is not to whitewash the state and the real challenge of Islamophobia, but to say that the efforts that we are making, not we Muslims, but all of us who believe in the decency and equality of all Americans, when we do stand together, we win. And we're seeing that this weekend, again, in these pseudo-protests that were supposed to happen. A lot of hype, but very few people actually showed up. And one more example I want to point to is something that happened earlier this year, where in Phoenix, there was an armed biker gang that organized an armed protest. This is an open carry state, right? An armed protest outside of a mosque, and hundreds of bikers did show up. And it was terrifying to the community, but there were also interfaith allies who made a circle basically around the mosque and stood there with love. That's what happened the day of. What happened 5 days later, and that got media attention, I should say, is that the biker gang got media attention because, again, conflict makes news. 5 days later, the mosque opened their doors up for an open mosque day, if you will, and over 1,000 people from Phoenix came into the mosque to meet their Muslim neighbors, far greater than the numbers of people who showed up to be the protesters outside. And that, to me, is the story of America. But did that event make it to CNN? Absolutely not. But the good news is we do have social media, and so more people knew about it than would have known about it in the past. But these are the spaces where I think we have opportunities, is to amplify the good. Because it's very easy to get discouraged by the bad and to feel like, well, what's the point? And that's a lot of what we're seeing within our own communities, is the psychology of 15 years of feeling like, guilty until proven innocent, has really put our community through a beating. But the silver linings that we are seeing every day, where good people are standing up to say, that's not my America and that's not my religious values, and my religious values teach me to get to know other people. And even if I have no religious values, right, that the values of human decency say get to know people before you judge them, we can win if we just keep standing up with each other. And again, that's a reason I'm extremely grateful for this place, because I think the work that our teachers, Reverend Regis, Dr. Hatut, and Rabbi Bierman did was to model for us what that looked like. That it wasn't always to just stand in protest or stand outside and do that hard work, but to sit inside and to talk with one another and to bring our communities with one another. That it's not the hard power, but the soft power that they really showed us has the biggest impact, by bringing ourselves together to learn from each other, not just about each other, that we can have real impact that changes not just us and our hearts, but the generations that are growing up after us.
Wonderful. So let me just footnote that we've been talking about how important it is at All Saints Church to evaluate all policies and all historic events, primarily in terms of the impact it has on the marginalized, the vulnerable, the poor, those people who are getting it in the neck. And, our scripture is dripping with when you stand with, when you visit with, when you're in solidarity with the least of these, that you are with God. That is the way you are with God. So Edina, just to put another word on it, is talking about proximity. How really important it is for you and me to have in our circle of friends not just Christians or not just people from our own cultural background, but really to step outside our comfort zone and be in proximity with people who have very different religious and cultural backgrounds than we do. Now, before I ask her the next question, I just want to tell you that we're not just calling you to something. We have a delivery system for you to do that. So I want everybody in this room who belongs to our Interfaith group. Now, this is a group of people who make it their business to get together in a synagogue, a mosque, or here at All Saints Church or another Christian organization on a regular basis so that this proximity and learning from one another and being in solidarity with one another relationally and emotionally can take place. So would you all stand, the Hydes, come on, everybody else, Betsy. Now, these people, Muslim, Christian, Jews are in this room, and if you want to get involved and have an instrument through which you can increase your proximity and step outside your culture zone, you can hang a little bit after we say amen and talk with one of these people, and they will be glad to take your contact information. Oh, and they're meeting today, so that you can get involved in their meeting today. Thank you all. So, thanks for your leadership. So I'm torn, but I'm going to go with my heart here, because Edina, we need to talk about young people, and we need to talk about young Muslims, and this is a kind of a sharp question. Dr. Hathout and Salam and a couple of other people talked with Susan Russell about wanting us to broker a conversation between them and Father Greg Boyle, to talk about what Father Greg Boyle is doing. And by the way, he's going to be my last guest in the Rector's Forum in April. What he does in terms of really listening beneath the surface of the violence of gang members to the needs that gangs are providing for these young people, and how can what Greg has done, Father Greg has done, is interpret that to a call and a challenge to the Catholic parishes where he works. And Dr. Hathout and Salam were saying, what are comparables for us in Islam to take a look at kids, teenagers, who are really, and this was right after the Boston bombings, looking at the Sarnoff brothers, what about that? Now, I have bookmarked to this, and I haven't read the article yet, Edina, but a recent article that got my attention is how ISIS is having success recruiting particularly young women into it. And so I know you've got some things to say.
Layers of things to say. So ISIS's main recruits are young men, to be clear, but they are having a surprising level of success with young women. And the first thing to note about ISIS is that ISIS's successful recruiting is happening almost entirely online. So the FBI says that ISIS and its supporters tweet out about 90,000 times a day. So that's where your uphill battle is. So frequently we get these questions about, so what are mosques doing? And this used to be the question 10 years ago, used to be the question, what are mosques doing to prevent extremism? Just like in the Boston case, those two brothers, one of them was actually asked to leave a mosque twice because he stood up and interrupted a sermon with some contrarian language. And mosques have been doing everything they can to be proactive in not just identifying extremists, but promoting healthy young people, healthy understandings and accurate understandings of Islam. Where ISIS is effective is online, primarily with young people who are politically agitated. They see atrocities and disasters and tragedies in the Muslim world, and they wonder, what can I do? Right? So if they're seeing the situation in Syria, or whether it was Iraq, or what, you name your challenge out there, or especially where they saw U.S. forces or international forces that they believed were targeting Muslim populations, this sort of political unrest and political anger, young people most often have sought an avenue to be effective. Right? What should I do? My faith calls me to do something to fight injustice. And writing a letter to my member of Congress doesn't feel like an effective way to fight, to fight back against these kinds of injustices. And so ISIS's main arguments online are
taking obscure faith traditions, right? So whether, if you've heard of, there's the Quran, right, which is the literal word of God according to Muslims, and then there's hadith, which are traditions of what was said or done by Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Some of those are stronger, more valid, you might say, or authenticated, and others of those are weaker. ISIS cherry picks these obscure passages or traditions that exist and tries to universalize them, or cherry picks verses out of the Quran that sound like there's a verse in the Quran that says, "Kill them wherever you find them." You take that out of context and you say, "All right, let's do this." Right? This is how I fight injustice. But in context, that verse exists because if you are in a declared wartime situation and there is a declared enemy that is threatening your life, you are allowed to defend yourself. That's the context. But if you were not raised or do not have enough Quranic literacy to know that, then your faith can be used in order to fuel you to the worst possible actions, and that's a part of how ISIS is operating. Is they're recruiting young people online saying, you've got grievances, and your grievances are justified because the West is trying to oppress Muslims, and if you need to move to these Muslim lands, and young women, if you can't fight, you should come and be the brides of ISIS. And the fact that young men are going to join the fight, quote unquote, and young women are going to become brides of ISIS is what hurts me to my core, because they are going to their own death sentence. And because what ISIS is doing, ISIS has reached, new lows every week. To watch ISIS troops, so-called, beheading people en masse is one thing that I thought I wouldn't see anything worse than that. But now to be reading about how ISIS has taken something as foul and inhumane as rape and turned it into something that they justify Islamically, falsely justify Islamically, that speaks to the level of depravity and the lack of humanity that exists within this group, because these are antithetical to the core teachings of Islam. The core teachings, these are not obscure, the places of obscurity. These are core central teachings. And that people in such large groups are falling for it speaks, I think, to a level of, one, religious ignorance, right? So Muslims themselves who have not read their own texts and who are therefore being manipulated by charismatic voices who are leading them down false paths, again, connecting back to gangs, or young people who come from troubled backgrounds and who are looking for a sense of belonging, of meaning, of purpose. And fighting injustice is a very tantalizing way to apply yourself if you do not feel that your life has purpose. The good news is that the number of recruits from the US that are going to join ISIS are very small in relation to even what we're seeing from Europe or other places. But it's still far too much. That young people, whether it's in Colorado or in Minnesota, I've read about stories of young people who, disappear from their families' homes in the middle of the night. And the parents don't even know, and these young people who are then going off to whatever fantasy they have about what's going to take place. These are the real problems that, again, while social media has helped us in so many ways to be able to claim our stories and claim our communities and claim decision making, so too does social media have that place of pulling people into an evil quicksand that is very difficult to get out of.
Edina rearranged her schedule to be with us this morning when I begged her to come and let's have this conversation. Because
Exactly. When Reverend Ed calls, you've got to make it work.
I knew it would be stimulating and informative, and I'm so deeply grateful. And she may have a minute I'm sorry I didn't have time to open for questions, but I thought we needed to deal with these. For those of you who are streaming, we hope that you stay tuned. We've got an amazing worship service coming up in which we have an amazing witness to talk about inclusion without footnotes that will inspire you, and a great sermon and wonderful baptism with a lot of wild and woolly water being slung all over the place. And if you would like to contribute to All Saints Church, there's a donate button on our website. Now is the month of giving. We want absolutely everybody who touches us and is touched by us to help support us so that we can continue to be bright and bold and daring and brave in these times of chaos, to offer a counter-narrative of inclusion and justice and healing and peace. So now will you join me once more in thanking Edina Lekovic for being with us today.